How to Hide a Body. Burying and Unearthing Trauma by Ecclesia Baum. Part 2. Life. Chapter 5. Burial. Moving on is a difficult concept to wrap our minds around. People say it so easily sometimes, like it doesn't require us to overcome all of the things that we believe about ourselves, the people around us, and the world. People say it so easily sometimes because nothing has ever changed their lives that much, or because they fool themselves into thinking that they've successfully moved on. In reality, it isn't easy to put our past to rest. It isn't easy at all to bury someone that is dear to you. Still, if we can overcome the preconceptions and the fears that are immobilizing us and take things one step at a time, we can finally start moving forward. It will feel surreal, and it will feel unpleasant, but most importantly, it will feel final. Religious reasons aside, people hold funerals not because they are per se practical or because the dead ask for it, but because of the sense of finality. Even though the dead have no opinion on the matter, the living absolutely need it. Those of us that are still alive need that moment to acknowledge our sense of loss, to say our goodbyes, and to make their absence from our lives feel real. We need to make their passing distinct from the frustratingly mundane everyday life that, in many ways, seems to keep repeating as if nothing has changed. Even though it hurts to acknowledge that death is final, we still need to do it in order to navigate the grieving process. We need finality for ourselves. A piece of us has died, and the world as we know it can never be the same. We absolutely need to be able to acknowledge that. We can't just be the person we used to be anymore. We can't even pretend to be that person. We need to come to terms with the fact that this is us now. That this is us without our reckless courage, without our ignorance, without our innocence. This is us now with our radically different goals and dreams and hopes. Our eyes will never see the world like they used to. And that's okay. We're people, and we were always bound to change. This isn't the change we wanted, but change was bound to happen one way or another. We were always going to become disillusioned by this world, and it was only a matter of when and how suddenly. We were always going to get hurt. It was only a matter of how badly and how often and by whom. There was always going to come a day when we looked back and realized that we weren't the person we used to be. We don't have to like it, but we do have to acknowledge it. When we recognize that everyone else has to change too, this person that we are now can find some sense of belonging. By laying our old self to rest, we no longer have to be beholden to it. We are no longer able to pretend it's still salvageable or to pretend that nothing happened. We don't have to stress ourselves out trying to preserve something that can't be saved. We can look at ourselves with a sense of finality and acknowledge that from this moment on, this person that I am is different and new, and I must continue living on in spite of what has happened. We acknowledge the end of an era in our lives and the beginning of a new one. Obstacles. Still, the mere acknowledgement of the end of one era doesn't mean that we cruise into the next feeling whole. Finality and closure are not necessarily the same thing. A funeral is a symbolic gesture marking the end of a life, but it is not the end of mourning. Mourning takes time. Like a mourner, we bid farewell to the old us. Like a mourner, we mourn past the burial. To some extent, hurting is normal. Change often hurts, especially when change is birthed by hurt. We will have bad days. We will have days where we suddenly remember what happened, and there will never be a day that we look back at our old selves without a twinge of pain. But with time, we should reach a state where the pain no longer cripples us. There should be a time where we feel closure. If our lives are stories, then that dark chapter in our lives should reach an ending, and another chapter should begin. Mourning is supposed to be a temporary transition point, a layover in a larger, overarching journey. But there are things that detain us in the state of mourning past the time of our projected departure. What keeps us lingering in the doorway between finality and closure? Fear. The process of moving on forces us to confront our fears. What is this new person born of trauma afraid of? Is it the sense of vulnerability, losing control, inadequacy, betrayal, heights, people, storms, pain? We've adopted so many new fears, and we can't progress in our lives without first coming to terms with the things that scare us and then allowing God to dismantle them. I use the word dismantle because, generally speaking, it is a deconstruction of the defense mechanisms that we have built up, and it can take much longer than plain demolition would. This isn't because God's just a slow worker, but because we tend to make ourselves into long-term projects. It's not easy for us to just let go of the things that we fear the most. Fear becomes habit. We've trained our eyes to spot certain red flags, and now red is the only color we notice. Our minds race from threat detection to contingency plan in an instant before we have time to think about anything else. We need to practice thinking differently about the things we fear. Yes, I'm afraid of being emotionally vulnerable because I think it will make me easy to attack, but I have God now, so attacks are not effective, and it doesn't matter if my guard is down. I am afraid of being injured, but only God can control that, and I know that He can get me out of any situation that I get into. I am afraid of rejection because it signifies that someone doesn't value me as a person, but I don't need to take it personally because I don't need them to value me because I have God-given value and thus I value myself. I am afraid of loss, but I can trust in God who gives and takes away, and I know that I will never lose more than I can handle. I am afraid, but I trust in God's assessment of me as a person, and if He thinks that I can handle it, then I can handle it. If we engrave these thoughts into our mind, they can interrupt our normal panicking and catastrophizing. Sometimes there is hardly a thought process to interrupt because our fear is visceral. Our bodies are afraid, not just our mind. Like the way our hand jerks away from a flame, our reactions are ingrained. It's as if our eyes see the potential threat and our body just reacts with no thoughts to govern it. These reactions are the most discouraging because we do them before we can stop ourselves, and they can happen at inappropriate times. They remind us that even though we have mentally overcome our fears, we are still physically afraid. Nonetheless, even biological reflexes that literally bypass the brain can be stopped sometimes if we anticipate them. Our behaviors have changed before, and they can change again. With enough wisdom and foresight, we can identify a situation that may trigger an inappropriate response and brace ourselves for it. If we know the forecast, we can prepare for storms. If we know we're meeting someone new, we can mentally prepare ourselves for potential handshakes and side hugs. If we know it's the 4th of July, we can try to prepare ourselves for unexpected explosions. If we go to a bonfire, we know to expect the smell of smoke. Still, it isn't easy to prepare ourselves for our trigger. In my experience, the Holy Ghost is an invaluable tool in reflex management. The voice of God is a lifesaver in unpredictable situations and can catch us before we do something that we regret. It can stop us before we throw up a block or urge us to move again when we freeze up, and it can stabilize us so quickly that any odd behavior on our part is virtually unnoticeable. In addition, the wisdom of God helps us to distinguish which reactions are normal human reflexes and which ones are excessive or abnormal. Not all of our reactions are abnormal. If we jump at the sound of a gunshot or a thunderclap, that is nothing to beat ourselves up about. That is a normal human reaction. If we flinch when someone grabs us out of nowhere, that's normal. Even the Bible says to lay hands suddenly on no man. If we scream when a car starts veering into our lane, that's a pretty normal response. Just because someone harmed us before doesn't mean we're weak or strange or overly sensitive for flinching at real assault. Not all of our reactions are over the top, and not all of our reactions are detrimental to our quality of life. There is no need to feel insecure about every reflex. Really, there's no need to feel guilty at all unless we're hurting someone. If we're not reflexively punching people in the nose or bullying people or making our lives worse, there's no need to beat ourselves up about a knee-jerk reaction. Let's be kind to ourselves. Our fears may not all originate directly from our trauma, but may instead be secondary insecurities resulting from our preconceived notions of what change and recovery are supposed to be. Even though the fears weren't necessarily born from trauma, they are fears that are revealed by our current situation, and they are fears that prevent us from moving on, so they are still fears that we need to get through. We may fear the concept of counseling, whether it's counseling from God, from a pastor, from a mentor, or from a mental health professional. Even though counseling is becoming more and more mainstream, we still tend to look down on it as something that only crazy people need. That isn't true, especially of the counseling that God provides. Counsel is just another word for advice, and we all need advice at some point in our lives. We weren't just born with all the answers. It is normal and intelligent to seek advice in matters that we don't know how to handle on our own, and we're only crazy to turn it away for the sake of our pride. We fear that someone will think that something's wrong with us. Asking for help is an admission of a problem, and we don't like to admit that we have a problem. We don't want to go to the pastor's office because we don't want people to ask questions. We don't want to pour our hearts out at the altar because we don't want people to watch us and wonder what happened. We've tried to pretend we're fine so long. The idea of appearing as anything less than fine deeply disturbs us. But really, who cares if people think that there's something wrong with us? Isn't it true? Who cares if people wonder what happened to us? Let them wonder. They're not the ones who need to keep living in our bodies and with our memories. We are. We fear that someone will take advantage of our vulnerability if we allow ourselves to be counseled. Many of us already know the pain of having our trust broken, and we feel that the only way to prevent it happening again is by never giving anyone the opportunity. If we hide our wounds, no one can rub salt in them. But if we hide our wounds, no one can treat them either. So how can we know for sure whether someone will heal us or hurt us? We can never be sure. Every relationship that we engage in has some measure of risk that we can never totally mitigate. How are we supposed to connect to others then if there's always the chance that they will hurt us? All we can do is try to assess the risks properly, not blinded by naivete and not blinded by defensiveness. A licensed counselor is more likely to have a constructive conversation with us than a stranger at a party. A wise pastor who has conducted himself with moderation is less likely to betray us than a person who shares gossip with us. We need to be as wise as a serpent and as harmless as a dove, and just try our best. We have to be able to recognize which betrayals in our lives were statistical outliers. Basing our understanding of all human behavior on 1 or 2 or a dozen instances is really bad science. Not every man is out to get us. Not every woman wants to stab us in the back. Not every preacher wants to manipulate us. Not every saint is a hypocrite. Betrayal can be perpetrated by literally anyone across the board, but it's not exactly common or even intentional. Even well-meaning people will hurt us because of their ignorance or their recklessness or their emotions in a heated moment, or even because of simple differences in communication styles. We do the same to others. If we quit focusing on the characteristics that we arbitrarily associate with betrayal, we can instead focus without prejudice on the pattern of a person's actions so that we may understand them as an individual. If we can try to implement a little wisdom instead of panicking and unilaterally shutting everyone out, we can actually have people that we can lean on and that can help us. We fear public opinion. There are some things that American culture has not learned to have appropriate sympathy for. Historically, society has not given male victims of rape or domestic violence the same sympathy that they've given to female victims, because victimhood undermines the idea that men are supposed to be strong. Historically, society has associated drug addiction with delinquent or criminal behavior without considering external and internal factors that led to it, and without considering the things that non-users use to self-medicate. Historically, society has written off PTSD because they can't understand how what they consider to be a normal, everyday thing is a trigger to someone else. They can't wrap their minds around fear and horror, and they don't understand why, when so many people come back fine, some people come back crazy. And God forbid someone ever admit that trauma affected their sexuality or gender identity. The public will burn them at the proverbial stake and cancel them for all time, or for as much time as the scatterbrained media can keep their focus on them until the next social pariah comes along. But why waste time fearing the scrutiny of a construct as ill-defined as public opinion? Why fear the criticism of some vague specter that is defined by and can only make itself known through the media and through faces of the media which are incapable of impartiality? Public opinion is a contrived notion used to push an opinion without any accountability, a body which can never be reviewed. It cannot even be represented because it is an abstraction. The concept of a public opinion in the absence of a unified public is just a fictional character designed by news outlets to inspire enough moral panic to drive up the ratings. It's meaningless to us. Who exactly are we afraid of? Who are we trying to please? Who is the face of public opinion in our day-to-day life? Is the cashier at our neighborhood Walmart that silently rings us up public opinion? Are our hundreds of nameless classmates who just want to graduate and just need to get to class public opinion? Is public opinion on our front porch with picket signs telling us that we don't deserve to get better? Every now and then, a person or a group may be delusional enough to think that they are the emissary of public opinion, but no individual or group at any time can ever really be the public's voice, because with one wrong move, the public abandons them. In most cases, public opinion is only an entity on our phone or our laptop, and they're gone in a couple swipes or clicks. Is public opinion real, or is it just a person writing an article asking everyone to agree with them on the assumption that everyone already agrees with them? Is public opinion real, or is it just a mob of bored user accounts brought together by an algorithm? Is public opinion real, or is it a rumor that we heard, an old wives' tale, a fictional boogeyman that we've never grown mature enough to disbelieve? Let's not trouble ourselves over what a faceless phantom like public opinion thinks. People tend not to care about what we do as much as we think. And if they do care, what are they going to do about it? They can ignore their own issues and care about ours all they want. We have better things to do. We fear change. We fear the effort that change requires. We fear failure. We don't know if we can exert that much effort. We don't want someone to waste their help on us. We don't want to waste our own energy. We are an exercise in futility, a doomed project, we think. If our failure is as inevitable as we believe, then why tire ourselves out? Why struggle against fate? Why? Because our failure isn't set in stone, no matter how solid we think our logic is. Because we are projects, but we're worthy projects. And if the only fear that is stopping us is the fear of failure, then the only logical response is to try. By not trying, we're already failing. It's like the 4 lepers in the Bible during the famine. They realized that if they went to the camp of the Philistines, they may be saved or they may die. But if they did nothing, they would definitely die. We're already messed up. If we try and we don't get better, then what does it matter? We're no worse off than when we started, and at least we get points for trying. But maybe, just maybe, we could get better. Even if we think the chance of success is slim, there is a 100% chance that we will fail if we don't do something. To be immobilized by our fear of failure is to be blind to our current state of failure. It's time to let go of all of our presumptions and let God help us. God knows exactly what scares us, and He knows how it prevents us from becoming self-actualized and effective in Him. We really can change. Haven't we changed before? That was the whole problem. Something big changed us. Something big can change us again. If our only options are the consistent hell of now and the possibility of happiness, why not try for happiness? Bitterness. Our anger is a flower that blooms within us, whose seed was embedded in the wound in our hearts. It may spring up quickly like a weed in the backyard, or take its time to grow as we mature and begin to nurture it, but it grows, and the root that keeps it anchored to our hearts is bitterness. Bitterness is the feeling of resentment that lingers after the initial hurt. It is the tantalizing urge in us to hold on to the trespasses of others, the instinct to never forgive and never forget. As I mentioned before, anger isn't a sin. Bitterness is. Bitterness is the sin of perpetuating an anger beyond its expiration date, of maintaining an anger that should have been dealt with. It is postponing the execution for an anger that is supposed to die. Anyone who has tried to pull weeds knows how important it is to pull a weed up by the roots. Roots are the life of the plant. We can pull the petals off of our wrath so that we can pretend it's some other flower that we're cultivating. We can trim down the stem so that it doesn't show. We can even let it run its course and wilt with the changing seasons. But if we don't pluck the whole thing out of us, it can still regenerate. Where the root remains, a plant can sprout up again and recover. We think that the dandelions are gone. We think we finally got rid of those horrible little thorns tangling themselves with the hydrangeas, but sure enough, they seem to return in the same places. Our anger doesn't die because our bitterness remains. Anyone who has tried to pull weeds knows how difficult it can be to pull a weed up by the roots. They always go deeper than we expect and than we are willing to investigate. They hold tighter than we have the strength to pull. They break off into more pieces than we have the patience to address. And the longer that they've been there, the more ingrained they are. The longer we leave our bitterness unchecked, the more difficult it is to get it out of our system. It doesn't just go away, and that's why we call it bitterness. We relate the lingering unpleasant feelings we have for another to the sensation of eating something sharp and pungent, and we relate the memories to the strong impression of eating a bitter food for the first time. The actions of others can leave such a bad taste in our mouths. And aren't our feelings justified? Our anger was justified, so why not our bitterness? The flower was acceptable in its season, so why not the root? Why is it wrong to hold on? Why is it wrong to keep resenting? We were the victims. They hurt us. And now they can't fix us, even if they wanted to. Why should the bitterness die before the pain does? If the pain is like the cracks in the broken ground of the garden of our hearts, then bitterness is the plant growing hungrily in those empty spaces and fracturing it further. Bitterness is greedy for space, and it chokes out our other emotions below the surface, even in the absence of the visible symptoms of anger that it supports. We can smile and laugh and be kind and be gentle all day long. We can pretend that nothing is bothering us. We can keep it all buried and nothing will go wrong. That is, until the conditions are right. Until something that somebody says or some similar situation or something familiar reminds us and nourishes our anger again. It leaches all of the nutrients out of our hearts until nothing else can grow there. Our dreams, our hope, our joy, every positive feeling we try to sustain is starved. Only when we remove bitterness can our broken souls settle back together and smooth back over and replenish their richness. Only when we pluck the roots out can we fill in our gaps without the risk of bitterness taking back over. Only then can we open up our hearts willingly and allow ourselves to flourish. But it isn't fair, is it? We're not the ones who planted this infernal flower, so why are we the ones who need to remove it? Shouldn't the other person deal with it? Shouldn't they be the ones to make it right? Shouldn't they reap what they sowed in us? We didn't ask for any of this. Why do the innocent suffer? Why do the living have to take on the burdens of the dead? Why do the victims' wounds heal slower than the abusers? Why are we always the ones with the most to lose when we aren't to blame? It's not like this is what we wanted. Who is the one with the most control over bitterness, though? Is it the one who broke open the ground and made room for the seed, or the one who nurtured the seed to grow? The terrain of a given place directly affects the life it can support. The ground determines whether a seed will flourish. It's true that our abusers have gouged a hole into the ground of our hearts, and that they gifted us with that first bloom of anger, but any fool can dig a hole. Any fool can drop a seed. Who tended to the plant? We are the gardeners of our own heart. We are the ones that refuse to let the anger die, and as such, we are capable of sowing the same seeds that were planted in us. Flowers don't simply bloom to be seen. Flowers are the precursor to fruit, and fruit to seeds. The longer we leave our bitterness unchecked, and the longer we keep allowing wrath to blossom in us, the more likely it is for us to show the fruits of our resentment. We waste our time in bitterness and become guilty of neglecting others. We misdirect our gall at the wrong people and cause them unnecessary hurt. We break the hearts of those who want the best for us and try their best for us because we can never be satisfied. Our fruits bear the same seeds that were planted in us and we planted in others. We perpetuate anger and bitterness. We cultivate it. How are we keeping our bitterness alive? We ruminate on the things that people have done to us for weeks, months, years. We'll pour decades of vitriol into it. We wallow in self-pity. As long as we selfishly hyper-focus on our victimhood, we convince ourselves that our resentment is justified. We stop being conscientious of the way that it affects our emotions. When our anger is stirred up without fail by certain circumstances, when we can't talk about a subject without venom seeping into our words, we ignore the implications. We pretend that this thorny wildflower that we're growing isn't what it is. With tenacity, with self-pity, with willful ignorance, we sustain our bitterness. But what's the point? Does our anger ever reach its intended target? Or are we just hurting ourselves and the people around us by wasting our energy on a grudge? Bitterness won't change our past. Bitterness won't help our future. Bitterness is just wasting our energy to protect ourselves from a threat that may never come. We're letting ourselves be controlled by the sins of others. We are giving too much power to our abusers. They are, in effect, controlling our thoughts, not even by a continued effort on their part. They just take control passively, unintentionally, easily, like a pickpocket who takes the wallet for the money but also finds a social security card inside. They probably weren't cunning enough to do anything with our social security number. They probably took the cash and threw the rest away. But we're scrambling to protect our identity anyway. Is that what we want? Doesn't it offend us that they can have that kind of power over us without even putting in the work? Isn't that just senseless? We could do so much more. We could free up our hearts and our minds and think more productively and more positively. We can weed out the bitterness that is choking out our potential for happiness and make these overgrown yards into beautiful gardens. If we allow God to help us manage our emotions, we can finally move to a place of acceptance and forgiveness. If we allow God to help us manage our pain, we can finally obtain some clarity and the peace of mind that we need in order to move into a new season in our lives. If we allow God into our hearts, we can bring forth better fruit. Addiction. The reason I don't discuss addiction as a standalone coping mechanism is because addiction is a symptom. Often when society sees someone who struggles with addiction, they assume that the addict's root issue is addiction itself. That can be the case, but the roads that lead us to addiction don't all start in the same place. In fact, they don't even all start in trauma. Sometimes, as evidenced by anyone who can't stop smoking, it is literally a physical condition we find ourselves in by chance. Addictions are opportunistic feeders that prey on the weak, and they can't be classified into one species. Some addictions, such as an addiction to prescription medications, hunt like lions and pick out the sick or the injured from the herd. Some, such as an addiction to recreational drugs, hunt like snakes and bite the healthy among us when we end up in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they consume us when we succumb to their venom. Some, such as party culture, the nationally endorsed obsession with sports teams or celebrities, are filter feeders that swallow up society or segments of the population en masse like krill, and we're just swept along with everyone else. Just as there are multiple ways an animal may become prey, there are multiple reasons that a person can become addicted. Regardless, addiction is a predator, and it can be extremely difficult to escape. That being said, I only intend to discuss addiction within the context of trauma and as a method of perpetuating various coping mechanisms that develop from different motivations. The lion, who targets the ones that can't run as quickly as the rest, and who is never above stealing kills from other predators. There are times when we want to appear normal, so we will turn to addictive things to bring us back to normal. There are times when we want to escape pain, so we turn to addictive things to numb us or comfort us or distract us. There are times when we feel too numb and we want to feel anything different. These are the basic motivations for our addictions, and sometimes we are knowingly striving to accomplish these motivations, and sometimes we just sort of end up this way. We don't even see it coming. Although chemical dependency is a huge obstacle that can be painful or even deadly to reckon with, addiction isn't as simple as chemical dependency. Indeed, we can get treatment for the routines and tangible consequences of addiction, but still find ourselves contending with the same desperate, wretched impulses that drove the addiction in the first place. Even when our body stops craving, our mind is frantic for relief or distraction. Thus, the only way to truly overcome our addiction is to deal with our mental struggles. We need to address the pain that opens the door to addiction. Why doesn't everyone who takes a drug become addicted? Why doesn't everyone get addicted to prescription painkillers? Because people only take drugs as long as they're hurting. For most people recovering from surgery, they only hurt during the time it takes to heal. For us, we are always hurting, and every burden we take on and stressor we encounter becomes a new ache that we're itching to treat. Our brain reimagines the emotional pain we feel as physical pain, and we feel justified to medicate. We may even use a doctor as an excuse, rather than taking enough accountability to recognize our own role in our addiction. We use all of the pills in the bottle, because if we weren't supposed to be on the medication this long, the doctor would have given us less to begin with. We ask to refill our prescriptions more than we should, and we tell ourselves that if it was bad for us, the doctor would stop us. This excuse won't last long with a good, ethical physician, but we cross that bridge when we get to it. A psychiatrist, however, is treating something significantly harder to quantify. Thus, they won't necessarily cut us off like another doctor might, and we can use them as an excuse longer. We say, I'm taking this because my psychiatrist told me to. But is that enough of an excuse? Why do they prescribe it to us? Is our condition solely caused by a chemical imbalance? It's possible. But isn't it also possible that we are forbidding anyone to touch the real cause of pain in us, and the psychiatrist has no choice but to prescribe something to mitigate our symptoms? Psychiatrists aren't miracle workers. They are paid to help us. That isn't to say that they're a bunch of ruthless mercenaries that just keep us doped up so that we can keep paying them, but that does mean that they are still expected to and required to try and help us somehow, even if we aren't cooperating like we should. Even if we don't want to admit to our trauma, they are still going to prescribe something to try to fix our emotions like we want them to. Even if we tell them what happened but pretend that it's irrelevant and that we're fine, they're still going to do their best. And sometimes the best that they can do is prescribe us something. And they will do so continually until we stop requiring it. But we don't stop requiring it, and that is a problem. We are not dealing with our pain and coming to terms with it, and we are regulating our emotions with drug usage. We are addicts. It doesn't matter if we're getting it from the alleyway or the pharmacy. It doesn't matter if it was recommended by a psychiatrist, a surgeon, or a friend who knows a guy. It doesn't even matter if it's a drug or not. If we are always needing something to mitigate symptoms of pain, instead of dealing with the source of the pain, we walk the path of an addict. The symptoms of trauma are not uniform. They can manifest as numbness, depression, anxiety, PTSD, emotional instability, insomnia, and a generally low stress threshold. The low stress threshold in particular can cause problems even after other symptoms have been resolved, and even after we are in a place where we consider ourselves sober. If we've forgotten, or if we've never learned any other coping mechanisms aside from self-medication, we find ourselves in a dangerous place every time life throws something difficult at us. Our first instinct when trouble comes is to console ourselves with our old vices. In moments of weakness, we are tempted to relapse. Many of us do. I don't say this condescendingly. I've relapsed too. An addiction becomes a comfort zone in the face of adversity. Would we be so desperate for a fix if we were better able to handle the stressors in life? Would we even think of self-medication as an option if we hadn't happened to find relief in it once before? We wouldn't. We'd pace, we'd bite our nails, we'd hide in the work bathroom and cry for a few minutes. We'd scream into a pillow, we'd eat a tub of ice cream by ourselves and beat ourselves up about it the next day, but would otherwise be fine. We'd call a friend and talk it out. We'd go for a run or clean the house or knit a scarf and do something with our nervous energy. We'd go out for a bit to clear our minds. We'd take deep breaths and count to 3 and try to think things through rationally. We'd pray. We'd seek God until we felt His peace surround us, until we could hear His voice talking us back down again. We don't do that because our flesh, that is, the part of us that is driven by self-interest and gratification, doesn't want to do that and doesn't think that it'll work and just wants us to do the thing that will assure us a little quick dopamine. But prayer can work. If we could just break the habit one time and pray, if we could seek God until we could actually feel His Spirit in us without a shadow of a doubt, not this boring, quiet sense of being in the presence of God we invent to convince ourselves of spirituality when nothing is happening, not even the hype that we feel when we're the spectator of a lively church service, but an actual, tangible feeling, a high that surpasses anything else that we've ever felt. If we could just have one breakthrough, we would have something else to turn to hold us together aside from the painful bondage of our addictions. Just like the first moment of self-medication became a game changer in our approach to pain, a single instance of effective prayer can be even more so. It could inspire us to be brave enough to pray the next time also, and the next after that. We could navigate into a place where our broken pieces are collected and put back together, instead of constantly trying to fill in the gaps with our addictions. Refusal. There was always going to come a day when our innocence was lost. I don't suggest that we deserved what had happened to us, nor do I suggest that anyone did us a service in expediting the disillusionment process in our lives. Innocence should be lost in much softer ways than what we've experienced. Nonetheless, we were always bound to be disappointed by the realization that things aren't as good as we thought that they were. But why then do we feel so out of place? Why do we try so hard to convince ourselves that things are fine? Confronting the reality of our situation and admitting that things are not okay are critical to our personal growth, but at the same time, we dread it. We've been putting off getting upset about it so long. We've been keeping the pain buried so long. We've been trying not to break down for so long that the thought of all of our efforts being absolutely undone is extremely unsettling. We aren't comfortable letting disillusionment smack the rose-colored glasses off of our faces. And yet, it is necessary. We can't keep living a life of enforced ignorance. We can't keep sacrificing our present and future in order to preserve an idealized retelling of our past. We can't erase trauma, nor can we forget the new and unpleasant things that trauma taught us about the world. If we force ourselves to pretend that things weren't that bad, we're forcing our present self to take responsibility for the seemingly unexplained struggles that we go through as a result of our redacted traumatic memories. With nothing to trace our current distress back to, we force ourselves to try to treat our present pain with no known medical history, and we put unnecessary stress on ourselves. Disillusionment is inevitable. We can't just live as children forever. That's not to say that our trauma is just some growing pain, but we can still use that pain to grow. We were born to grow. And part of growing is understanding the pain of living so that we can move on from being the sheltered child to becoming the adult who, in their understanding, is able to provide shelter. In our case, we understand suffering more than one ought, but at the same time, we have the potential to help alleviate greater suffering due to our particular knowledge. Were we not called to be witnesses? How can we be witnesses to people trapped in darkness and pain if we are intentionally ignorant to the concept of pain? Let's not keep pretending everything's okay. It's all right that not everything is okay. It's all right if we break. Brokenness is not the end, but it is a starting point in our relationship with God. God can make us strong enough to see what life holds for us after brokenness. Insecurity. We're so hard on ourselves sometimes. We ask ourselves questions like, why am I like this now? Why are the things that are easy for everyone else so hard for me? Why does it feel like everyone else is moving on and I'm stuck? Everyone else seems to get along just fine without having God straightening them back out every few weeks or days or minutes. We feel like we're just messing up all the time, and we feel like we have too many bad days. We feel like we should be able to keep our head on straight longer than we do. Why can't we just get better and stay that way? We compare ourselves to others, but we don't really understand the people that we're comparing ourselves to. Do we actually know for a fact whether they're struggling or not? We just see them from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, or midweek in Sunday service, or first and fifth period on a school day, or before we go to bed as we idly scroll through the facade that they've curated on Instagram. Even if we live with them, we only see the outside. We see the face that they choose to show us, just like we choose to show certain faces to everyone else. We feel like we're doing so much worse than everyone else because we can only see our side, and we don't realize how many people feel the same way when they look at us. Comparing our three-dimensional self-knowledge to the two-dimensional perception we have of the people around us is just absurd. All we can do is try to think the best of people, including our own selves. We feel like we're bad people because we keep having to start over and ask for mercy and keep getting God's help with things that we feel like we shouldn't have to struggle with anymore. But the reality is that we were always going to be less than perfect. We were always going to need God's grace and mercy all the time. We were always going to be dependent on God's help every day. If anyone looks down on us for our dependence on God, they are lying to themselves. There was never going to come a day on this earth where we transcend our human flaws and become mortal paragons of saved humanity. We are just human, and every human on earth needs God every day. Sometimes we don't even make an effort because we don't think we can do it right. Our inability to live up to our expectations discourages us from any serious attempts to move on. Perfectionism is just another word for pride, a form of procrastination, an excuse for putting off something so that we don't have to do it right now. Perfectionism is running away from the notion of failure. Are we too good to mess up a few times? Or is it that our pride makes failure into something we can't recover from? What makes us so great that we can't be less than perfect every now and then? Are we angels for whom a single sin drop kicks us into perdition? No, we're human, and we're as forgivable as any other human. We are as capable as any human, although a little less so as long as our insecurities keep holding us back. After all, who is really stronger? The perfectionist that can't get anything done because they can't do it to their own standards, or the screw-up that knows how to fail and to try again until something works? Let's at least try, and let's be patient. If it feels like it's taking too long to get better, let's wait a little longer. Let's let our efforts outlive our doubt. If we mess up, we are human. We get to try again. Our odds of success get better the more that we try. If we don't think that we're good enough to do it, who cares? Forget the concept of good enough. Let's do it because we can. If it's arrogant for someone like us to want more for ourselves, then let's be arrogant. Let's keep wanting and reaching until we have the wisdom to recognize that our arrogance was actually hope. If we don't think we deserve better, then let's just be greedy. Let's live a happy life that we don't feel like we deserve until the day that we can love ourselves and realize that we do deserve it because God's love makes us deserving. Self-love is necessary. We need real self-love, not this false bravado that we use to save face, not some overindulgent sense of entitlement. The Bible tells us to love others as if they were ourselves. Love for others and love for self are the same love. Just like with anyone else, we should love ourselves with patience and kindness. We don't deserve to be beaten up by ourselves and held to impossible standards. Our love for ourselves should be such that we don't hold our failures over our heads, just as we aren't supposed to hold the failures of others over theirs. Just as we ought for our neighbor, we ought to be able to bear all things, believe all things, hope all things, and endure all things for our own selves. Self-love is necessary for our own well-being, and it's necessary for our salvation. Maybe we think we're being noble by extending more mercy to others than we would for ourselves, but we are failing to really love them in one critical way. We are puffing ourselves up. By holding ourselves to a higher standard than we hold other people up to, we are making the statement that we are superior to others. We are implying that they are lesser beings that need extra lenience, while we are greater and should thus be measured differently. If we can't forgive people without believing that they're inferior to us, we aren't really forgiving them. We're just exempting them in the most disrespectful way possible. The person that we are, the people that they are, it's all the same. We're all just people, and we need mercy like anyone else. We are good enough to receive the same mercies as anyone else. God is no respecter of persons. We have the same chance as anyone else if we just give ourselves a chance. Artificiality. We live in a society that tells us to stay true to ourselves, whatever that even means. People talk as if there is an immutable, fundamental self at our core that directs us. We do certain things because that's just who we are. We believe certain things because that's just who we are. We follow some supposed internal pattern and console ourselves with the knowledge that our actions match our character. But on the other hand, we block ourselves from doing anything we consider to be out of character. We're afraid to be fake in a society clamoring hypocritically for authenticity. If we are harsh people, are we being inauthentic when we try to be more gentle? If we are known as someone who is angry at God, are we hypocritical when we start trying to go to church? I dated someone once who really kept track of changes in my appearance with great scrutiny. He wasn't insulting, on the contrary, he was all too appreciative. I became uncomfortable with his frequent comments on my body and appearance and his subsequent invasions of my personal space. And rather than distance myself from a person who was impacting my life and self-esteem in such a negative way, I became reluctant to make changes to my appearance or to dress in a way that could be flattering. I became extremely self-conscious to the point that I would question my own motives. How can I, with a clear conscience, wear this shirt that is actually my size instead of a hoodie that's 2 sizes too big when I know he'll make a comment on my figure and put his hands on me later? How can I use a different lotion or body spray as if it's because I like the smell when I know that it means he's going to notice and get closer? How can I complain that he makes me uncomfortable when I'm the one inviting his attention by making changes to myself? On the flip side, if my intentions were so pure to begin with, how could I be so self-conscious about changing myself? Doesn't my self-consciousness prove my wrong intentions? Don't I lack conviction in my own motives? However, the problem didn't lie in the changes. The problem centered around the fear that any change I made to myself was tacit consent to his objectification of me, which contradicted my unwillingness to be objectified. I was afraid that I was being too inviting, when in reality I was just a normal person who wanted to try different looks and who, unrelatedly, didn't want to be touched. Similarly, we are afraid to change because we are hurt by the allegations of duplicity made by the people around us. We are afraid of the scrutiny. We don't want our good deeds to be misinterpreted. We don't want our failures to come under the microscope and undermine our intentions. We don't want to get our hearts broken by people's negative assessments of us. We don't want to hear about how out of character it is for someone like us to take on something like change. In fact, we often don't want to draw any attention to ourselves at all. If we can just continue to be what we are to them, we don't need to make any explanation for ourselves. We can't act out the narrative that other people have for us forever. People aren't set in stone. We are like the earth is. It is, and it changes every day, sometimes gradually and unnoticeably, sometimes violently and abruptly. Its core is mysterious and constantly shifting, but it's still the earth. We are not cyclical patterns, but processes on a timeline, and we change over and over. We are a single breath of life from the mouth of God, cast in a walk-on role in the middle of a play that has basic recurring themes instead of a script. We are potential saints of God, and our will directs us closer to or further from this ideal. We are souls that can change in any number of ways according to our will and our ambition. Others may think we are acting out of character because the only way for people to understand each other is as characters. They can't know our thoughts and feelings. They can only view our actions as a manifestation of our thoughts and feelings, and they interpret our character based on their own prejudices. But forget about who we are to others. After all, we are different characters to different people, and if the way that they characterize us is skewed by their prejudices, it's outside of our control and therefore not our problem. Even without regard to the opinions of others, we can be afraid that we aren't capable of doing anything different from the skill set and the pattern established by our personal histories. Who are we to ourselves? What limit do we impose on ourselves through our own narrow self-image? If we have always been depressed, do we even have it in us to stop being depressed? If we're drug addicts, are we even strong enough to be sober? Or are we just kidding ourselves? Aren't we just going to try for a little bit and then just revert back to what we really are? Won't our true colors bleed through, however ugly they may be? How far from the tree can the apple fall? Who do we think we are, thinking that we can be something more? But who are we? The composition of our DNA? The sum of the thoughts and emotions that others have poured into us? Are we the natural consequence of innumerable circumstances? Are the traits of our soul really fundamental? We are known by the things that we choose to do. If an ex-con decides to help at a dog shelter, he becomes a volunteer. If a nun decides to rob a bank, she becomes a bank robber. If an addict never uses again, they become someone who is sober. If an abuse victim writes a book, they become an author. What we decide to do becomes the title we are known by. But even the things we do aren't who we are. They're just titles. They are not who we are, but merely a shorthand that helps others to have some understanding of us. They are a way for us to communicate to others part of what we are or what we think that we are. Then who are we? Are we the sum of our thoughts and memories? We can't be, because not every thought of ours is of consequence. Not every thought leads to something. We can't be because even when we forget things, we don't necessarily become someone else. Then who are we? In many ways, we are our will. When we want to indulge in the predictability of being stagnant, that is who we are. We are, in that moment, someone who doesn't want to change. When we don't know what we want, that is who we are. We are, in that moment, someone who is unstable and unsure. What we want to do becomes who we are at any given moment. When we want to get better, that becomes who we are. Our actions, seeking God, getting counseling, trying to become sober, trying to change our habits and thought processes, trying to recover, are not fake. They are authentic because they are born of our authentic will. Even if we think we are just doing it because it's what someone else wants, it is our will to use another person's feelings to explain our actions and to place importance on their opinion. It is our authentic will. Even if turning to God seems cheap, like we're not coming to Him because we love Him, but because we need Him, even then, it is our will to place importance on our concept of authenticity instead of the necessity of salvation. It is our authentic will. Even if wanting to recover or trying things to help us get better or establishing a relationship with God seems out of character to others or to ourselves, we're not acting inauthentically according to our will, so long as our will is to do those things. Our will defines our ability. There are people that have natural inclinations towards certain things. There are people who are naturally intelligent, or people who are naturally good at baseball, or people who are naturally extroverted. But these things don't manifest into abilities until their will pushes them to put forth the effort. A 4-year-old baseball prodigy will not outdo a Major League Baseball player if he never practices and learns the rules of baseball. There are probably people out there that were born with a remarkable ear for music, but they don't become musicians because they're interested in dentistry. I have personally always been skilled academically, but I have a very poor understanding of units of measurements and how to convert them, or Spanish verb declensions, or how the stock market works, because it has never been in my will to learn it. Conversely, even though I am tragically bad at understanding social cues and would sooner write a research paper than engage in small talk, I know how to provide excellent customer service and tell great jokes and pass for a mostly normal member of society, because it was in my will to be. Talent does not automatically grant knowledge and strength. These are things that people achieve by applying themselves. Just because coping in a healthy way was never something we were good at doesn't mean that we can't get good at it if we want to. If we mess up sometimes, that's inconsequential. It's not some sign that we were trying to be something that we were not and that we should have just stayed in our lane to begin with. It's not something that defines us. Our actions, positive or negative, are what we are to other people, but they aren't necessarily what we are. Mistakes are not proof that the progress we're trying to make is hypocritical, so long as our desire truly is to make progress. We didn't want to mess up. Maybe our flesh wanted to mess up, but the will of our heart was to do better. A person's flesh is certainly a major component of what we are, but it isn't who we are. Our flesh is just a default part of the human starter package. It is our sense of self-gratification. It is our lusts and appetites and tempers and attitudes. It's the persistent pull of our own carnality that always tugs the leash as we approach spirituality, but it isn't necessarily our will. That is why David is still considered a man after God's own heart, even after he killed Uriah to cover up his affair with Bathsheba. That is why Abraham can still be called the friend of God, even though he strayed from the will of God when it came to decisions related to his wife Sarah. Despite the errors of their flesh, their will, determined by their faith and their passions, in turn determined their works, their actions. The things that they were affected the things that they were to other people, and they earned their great titles because of the way their will directed their overall conduct. Where does our will come from? Our will is birthed by our desires, the things that we want. And what we want is a result of what we know, and what we think that we lack, and what we think is attainable or possible. Our desires are directly formed in the context of what we think we can do, or can have, or can become. Thus, it could be said that our will is a result of what we believe, or to reduce it down further, that what we believe is what we are. But this is the most important question. What do we believe, and what does that cause us to do? What does that stop us from doing? Do we believe that we are the person we were before we were hurt? By hurting, are we being inauthentic to the person we were when we didn't know pain? By acknowledging our heartache, are we inauthentic to the person we were back when we were whole? Do we believe that we are the person who is hurt? Are we never going to be able to surpass our status as a victim? Are we forever beholden to the concept of victimhood? By healing, are we ignoring where we came from? Are we leaving the people that suffered alongside us behind? By trying to change, are we inauthentic to the addict or the basket case or the loser that we think we are? Do we believe that we are the facade that we put up? Are we the expectations that others have for us? Are we trapped by the idealized notion of survivorhood? If we have a bad day, are we being inauthentic to the person everyone believes has moved on? If we relapse, are we inauthentic to our sobriety? To answer these questions, who cares? If our concept of identity ties our hands together, then it's a stupid concept. It's an excuse, a hindrance, an exhausting tidbit of human philosophy, a meaningless and overrated roadblock to change. Our concept of self isn't supposed to box us in, but to make us feel comfortable in our own skin, even as the things outside of us and the things inside of us change, to give us a sense of stability, a foundation to build ourselves on. If our sense of identity fails to do that, but instead restricts us from progressing, if it destabilizes us, then we need to realize that our fears are just trying to make room for themselves. We choose what we are, so let's choose what helps. Who cares whether people think we're fake? They aren't the ones living in our circumstances, so their opinions don't really matter. They don't understand our will. If they can't be supportive of us when we're trying to do something as sincere as moving on from trauma, then it is us who need to question their motives. There is no reason to give an ear to people who can't support our attempts at self-improvement, and if we can distance ourselves from their criticism, we can move more freely. After I broke up with my aforementioned boyfriend and got some distance, not just from him, but the concept of trying to define myself based on someone else, and the idea that I needed to endure pain in order to earn love, I was able to dress in ways that made me happy and try things that I wanted to try. I was able to change without second-guessing my decisions, and I became more confident in my ability to be something that I've never been, namely a secure person with a sense of agency and boundaries. Who cares about the character they see us as? Perhaps we should be suspicious of their character. Is there a reason that they don't want to see us become something else? Is there a reason that they are trying to resuscitate the corpse of our old selves when we are trying to do the right thing and lay it to rest? Is the character that they paint us as an understandable depiction, or does it just soothe their ego? Who cares if we think we're fake? If we feel like imposters, then let's be the most audacious imposters we can be and make the most out of it. Let's fake it until we make it. Let's act out our own will until we're confident enough to make new patterns that we are proud of, and until we can grasp the concept that what we are isn't set in stone. Let's believe in ourselves and believe in God, who expects the best for us. We have the potential to live well in spite of our past. Let's zero in on the things that are constant about us and use those things as an anchor. Let's test our insecurity and see if it was a real concern or just a fear. If our efforts outlast the insecurity, then we'll know it was the fear the whole time. Who cares if the changes we make don't come naturally? It doesn't matter if we have the innate sense of direction of a carrier pigeon or if we have to use the GPS and still miss half the turns. At the risk of sounding like a motivational poster or a commercial for a new sedan, the route doesn't matter, it just matters that we get there. We change every day, and we are not the same person today that we were yesterday. We are who we are now. And the self in the present will always be more authentic than the self of the past because there is no other self. And know this, as long as we're earnestly trying, God doesn't think that we're fake. He understands our motives and knows our beliefs. Our faith that things can get better gives us the desire to change, and our desire to change and the ways we act on it become what we are. Let's not get so caught up in being true to ourselves that we typecast ourselves. Self-awareness. As I have explained at length, we all try to find different ways to cope, but why? Our souls are restless for something. There are things that we are trying or pretending to achieve when we engage in our unhealthy coping mechanisms. If we can pinpoint and understand the things we're missing, we can stop relying on methods and habits that only yield cheap knockoffs of the results we need. Trust instead of advantage. After experiencing a loss of control, we overprepare for different variables that may affect our lives. This gives us a paltry sense of reassurance. We are trying our best to stay ahead of the game. We are anxiously exerting as much influence as we can over our surroundings, and we attempt to find comfort in the fact that things are statistically to our advantage. But statistical advantage isn't foolproof. If something is not absolutely to our advantage, then there is still a probability that something will go wrong, and within that margin of error, our powerlessness is revealed. We just can't control everything. There is someone who can, however, and that is God. The only way that we can get beyond our anxiety is to learn to trust in God and to trust in His love. And the only way to see if we can trust God is to talk to God. When we bring our needs before Him in faith, it gives Him an opportunity to show us that He will be faithful. He's not going to answer all of our prayers like we want Him to. After all, He has a better understanding of the things that we need than we do. Nonetheless, He does show us without fail that He's listening, sometimes by holding back the rain until we find shelter, sometimes by healing that long-standing cough, sometimes by gestures as small as letting you find the toy on your kid's wish list that you were praying would be there so you won't have to go to another store. Instead of pouring our energy into preemptive strikes and contingency plans, we need to learn to give God the chance to show His faithfulness by invoking His word and praying to Him. We also need to take moments to acknowledge the ways that He has already taken care of things for us. For one, we're alive. If we get too caught up in preventing disasters, we overlook the things that have been working without our management. We imagine a world where we're the only thing holding everything together, not realizing that there are so many processes that God is keeping in motion. If we stop and appreciate these things, we can start to realize that God taking care of us isn't some new phenomenon, and that realization leads us to trust, and that trust nullifies the need to try and manufacture our own security. Confidence instead of validation. It is the natural reflex of a man to hide his shame. Shame is a feeling that comes over us after we've done something wrong, and oftentimes, after going through something traumatic, we do feel like we've done something wrong. Maybe it was not listening to advice leading up to a disaster, or failing to drive safely, or not saying no more assertively, or something as out of our control as losing our virginity to a rapist. Maybe we're ashamed of our fragile mental state after the traumatic event. Maybe we're ashamed of bearing that stigma of victimhood in general. Regardless of our cause of shame, just like in the Garden of Eden, we sew our fig leaves together and hide in the thickets where no one can see our vulnerability. We try so hard to become an idealized version of ourselves so that we can feel validated by the people around us or society as a whole. But what we're really doing is just rebranding ourselves. It's a marketing campaign, and they are just consumers. If our secret ingredients are leaked or our celebrity endorsements fall through, who are we? As a person who has gone through traumatic experiences and has had to deal with the ensuing chaos, are we enough? I'm not asking if we're enough for everyone else. As we are we enough for ourselves? We aren't, and we feel that's our fault. We're ashamed of that, so we hide it. We pretend we are fine. But what is there to be ashamed of? We have got to quit blaming ourselves. Even if it was our fault, we've got to quit blaming ourselves. Even if we walked into the danger knowing the possibilities, we've got to quit blaming ourselves. Especially if we were a victim, we've got to quit blaming ourselves. It wasn't our fault. An adulterer violating us doesn't make us an adulterer. A fornicator violating us doesn't make us a fornicator. A pervert violating us doesn't make us dirty. The things that happen to us don't take away our value. We are still as fearfully and wonderfully made as we ever were. God made us inherently worthwhile. His attention alone assigns us worth. How can we argue with that? If the most intelligent and wise being in the universe tells us we're worth loving, what special insight do we think that we have that we could assume that he's wrong? When God speaks, things simply exist and become. If he calls us his child, then we just are. And the recognition of this fact is the birthplace of true validation. If we can believe in God's love, we can begin to see the same things in us that he sees and begin to love our own selves. We can stop overcomplicating our situation by trying to show everyone what we think that they need to see in order to accept us, because we'll feel comfortable enough in our own skin, not the masks we put on and the things that we hide behind, that we won't be desperate for their opinions of us anymore. Our names aren't curses. Our names just are, and God thinks that they matter enough to know them. Our stories aren't stigmas. Our stories just are, and God hears us when we talk about it. Our lives aren't books so vulgar that they need to be burned. Our lives just are, and God gives us every breath as we continue. Let's be confident in our own intrinsic value. Peace instead of distraction. It is with great fear that we try to escape the past. We run frantically. We welcome the flow of time that puts distance between us and those moments, while simultaneously carrying the same fears at all times. Where can we run to escape something that is a part of us? How do we outrun memories that inform what we are today? These are trick questions. Running away is impossible. We flee in hopes of finding a place of serenity, but there is no place like that. Peace is not a location or an object or a ritual. Peace is finding safety in God, and it comes from keeping our minds on God and on spiritual things. Peace derived any other way is counterfeit, and it further contributes to our sense of unease. We aren't finding peace when we engage in drug use. We are dampening our ability to feel pain for a moment, and the pain returns later tenfold. We aren't finding peace when we engage in escapism. We are merely playing pretend for a moment, and the real world is all the more disgusting when playtime ends. The more we flee, the more real we make the things that we try to escape. Our fears are measured by the distance we run. The only thing we can do is seek the peace of God. If we already have addictive or escapist tendencies, Sometimes it's just a matter of redirecting our habits. We can redirect our escapism by immersing ourselves in the Bible and finding things to think about that are so deep and intense that we can never find the edges. We can curb our appetite for addictive substances or experiences by seeking God's presence until we reach the feeling of euphoria that the Holy Ghost brings, and by striving for that sensation every time we feel overwhelmed. We can satiate our need to dissociate by allowing God's Spirit to speak to us and getting lost in His presence. If we aren't experiencing God's presence such that it can satisfy us in a way that our normal coping mechanisms cannot, then we are depriving ourselves of God's peace. We need to allow God's peace to calm our restless souls so that we can finally approach our lives with steady minds. Many of us are reluctant to allow God to help us because it's hard for us to wrap our minds around something in this world that could actually make us feel better. Nonetheless, God's peace can do more for us than we can comprehend if we would just give it a try. Order instead of justification. We often believe in alternate definitions of love and morality in order to help us understand what happened to us. If we say that love is simply connection or occasional instances of positive feedback or someone merely tolerating our company or attraction and lust, we can believe that a person loves us even as they abuse us. If we lower the bar for morality, we no longer find ourselves wanting to blame someone that others have failed to blame. Thus, we absolve others for their negligence and we deem our offenders' sins to be neutral actions. By redefining the concepts of love and morality, we can create a framework that allows our contradictory beliefs, they love me but they hurt me but no one cared, to make sense. And above all, we just want everything to make sense. This need for order manifests not just in the way that we invent systems of behavior that justify the things that have happened to us, but in our own actions as well. We are holding demonstrations to illustrate our own hypotheses, whether we realize it or not. We act the way we do and treat people the way we do in order to reinforce the lies we tell ourselves. However, no matter how we redefine a word, the underlying concepts don't change. Abuse is still abuse, even if we call it love. Right is still right, even if someone fails to uphold it. That's hard for us to accept for many reasons. Acceptance means admitting someone didn't love us well or love us at all, or admitting to flaws in trusted systems, or coming to terms with our insecurities regarding our self-worth or our victimhood. Acceptance means rejecting one of our deeply held beliefs, and it often means shattering that suspension of disbelief that was keeping us from breaking down. But we must. Our need for order can't be met by our attempts at justification because at the end of the day, there is always a shred of doubt in our minds. We say there's no one to blame, but we say it with a person in mind. We state our positions desperately because we know that our words will be met with skepticism, and a justified skepticism at that. We have to come to terms with the truth, not just the truth of what happened to us, but also the truth of God's word. It is often said that the truth will set you free, but that's wrong. The truth will make us free. It isn't some immediate release into freedom, but it's a deliberate process. We've got to take the time to process our past and to process God's word in the present so that we understand the future set before us. We need to come to terms with the truth of pain, of vulnerability, of change, and of love, and in truth we will find order. Closure instead of attention. Our cries for attention reflect a failure to accept the temporary nature of what happened to us. We can't let issues die for anyone else because they don't die for us, and we keep thinking that if we continue acting out, we can be recognized, justified. We can be equal to everyone else because we aren't the only ones in pain. We can be just like everyone else because our tragedy is made as real to them as it is to us. But it can never be enough. If we were to finally achieve the pity or commiseration of the entire world, it won't be enough, because the world can never lower itself enough to match our own dismal view of ourselves. If we see ourselves as the most misused and miserable creature to walk the earth, no amount of attention or acknowledgement can change that. It only fuels it. We're just making our lives worse by stirring up old issues all the time. Let's not pretend that keeping our trauma alive isn't at our own expense. When caught in a storm, a man may grab onto something sturdy so that he isn't tossed around by the wind or the waves. When the storm passes and he no longer needs to hold on for dear life, his hands momentarily forget how to do anything but hold on. Still, he must unclench his fists for his own sake, for even if rescuers come, how can they help him if he doesn't let go? We need to let the storm end when the wind dies down. We need to close the door on that chapter of our lives. Let go. Rest instead of exile. People can be exhausting without even meaning to be. They ask so many questions, sometimes well-meaning, but not always. They ask, "How are you?" and expect us to say, "I'm good, and you?" And it's exhausting. They say, "Is there something wrong?" But we know they don't have the time, or they don't have a way to help, or they won't understand, or that it's not fair for us to unload all our problems on them. And we say, "No, I'm fine," and it's exhausting. They say little things here and there that hit us too close to home, and we have to try and act like it doesn't bother us because explaining why it bothers us is such an ordeal, and it's just exhausting. Balancing who we are on the inside with who we try to be on the outside is a chore so tiring that we'd rather just be alone than deal with all of it. At least when we're alone, we can drop the act without consequence. But, again, we're social creatures. Loneliness brings its own set of problems, and in the echo chamber of our own company, there is no one to interrupt us as we spiral down further into our increasingly negative headspace. And this spiral is exhausting too. It's a place where we keep watching the same memories and thoughts rush by like scenery over and over. It isn't rest, it's just a different kind of torture. We need actual rest. And rest only comes when we stop carrying the burden of managing our own pain alone. Maybe we can't find other people to relate to us. Maybe it's not necessary to confide in people and tell passersby that, no, actually, there is something wrong. But we can stop thinking of our problems as something to shoulder alone. People are only the straw breaking our over-encumbered camelbacks. What are we so loaded down by that we can't handle a little straw? We need to understand what we're carrying, and we need to stop carrying it. If we give our burdens to God and take on what He gives us, which is entirely manageable, the pain of the past isn't so great a vulnerability that our energy is constantly sapped by it. Our burdens can be light enough that the company of others no longer exhausts us. Mourning. Let's stop avoiding it. Pain has picked up our scent and will stalk us forever until we turn around, look it in the eye, and face it head on. The only way through what's hurting us is through it. Not around it, not past it, not over it. If it hurts, we need to let it hurt. We need to deal with the pain directly, with our eyes open, with our hands open, with our hearts open. Grieve. Grieve for the people you lost. Grieve for your home that was destroyed. Grieve for the treasures that were taken from you. Grieve for the opportunities that slipped through your fingers. Grieve for your life's work that was wasted. Grieve for the time of security and the time of ease that is past. Grieve for the chances you never had. Grieve for the choices you were not given and for the choices that were stolen from you. Grieve for the beautiful things you never got to see. Grieve for the perfect childhood you never had. Grieve for the loving family you never had. Grieve for the bonds that you never had. Grieve for your marriages, friendships, relationships that were broken. Grieve for the words you didn't get to say. Grieve for the words that you can't take back. Grieve for all the years that were stolen from you. Grieve for your wounds. Grieve for your reputation. Grieve for your health and for your strength. Grieve for your innocence. Grieve for your love that was repaid with evil. Grieve for your trust that was betrayed. Grieve for the simplicity of your old life. Grieve for the future that you dreamed of. Grieve for the person you thought you'd be. Grieve for the promises you couldn't keep. Grieve for the decisions you wish you'd made. Grieve for the person you used to be, and let's try again.